The man known to history as John F. Kennedy was born on the 29th of May, 1917 at his family's home in Brookline, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was a prominent businessman with interests in property, banking, finance, and the motion picture industry. His mother, Rose Fitzgerald, was a socialite and philanthropist, the highly intelligent and college-educated daughter of the congressman and twice-elected mayor of Boston, John "Honey" Fitzgerald. Rose became a homemaker and a full-time parent after her marriage, as many middle-class and upper-class American women did during the early 20th century. But as her husband achieved greater financial success over time, her role as housekeeper gradually reverted to a supervisory one. Joseph and Rose Kennedy had 9 children, 5 daughters and 4 sons, of whom John, known affectionately within the family as Jack, was the second. Jack had complicated relationships with his older brother, Joseph, known as Joe Jr., as well as with their father. Joe Sr. and Joe Jr. were much alike, ambitious, athletic, and confident. They both loved Jack, and he loved his father and brother, both of whom gave him their attention and care. But Jack had little in common with either of them. As a child, where they were outspoken and outgoing, always dominating family dinner conversations, Jack was quiet and introspective. He had much more in common with his mother, Rose. Like his mother, Jack was intensely curious, a deep thinker, and a voracious reader from an early age. Rose Kennedy had shown far more academic aptitude and achievement during her high school and college years than her husband had. Rose graduated third from a high school class of nearly 300 students, and Jack seemed to have inherited her more intellectual and cerebral qualities. As a child, Rose recalled her second son struck her as a daydreamer, even a romantic. It seemed to her that during any conversation or while performing any task, Jack was only half present, while his other half was wandering somewhere no one else could follow. Perhaps it was because Joe Jr. idolized and emulated their father so much, or because Joe Sr. was so assiduous in cultivating a spirit of competitiveness within and among his children, that Jack sought to distinguish himself from his older brother. It may also explain why Joe Jr. and Jack fought with one another so frequently in childhood and why they proved to be so intensely competitive with each other later in life. Their father's constant emphasis on the importance of winning and success was something that all of Joe Sr.'s younger children absorbed as well. While it likely made for difficult growing pains among the Kennedy children, almost all nonetheless grew up to be extraordinarily successful people. 7 more Kennedy children followed Jack over the next decade: Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward. Of all his siblings, Jack was closest in his youth to his sister Kathleen, whom the family called Kick. Although Jack and Bobby, who were much further apart in age, became much closer in their young adulthood. The birth of Rosemary, just 16 months after Jack, no doubt gave him a classic middle child complex. Rosemary Kennedy was born with what is believed to have been an intellectual disability as a result of brain damage sustained from a critical lack of oxygen during her birth. By the age of 2, it was apparent that she was not developing cognitive or motor skills at the expected rate. With Rose's attention firmly focused on his younger sister and with Joe Jr. being their father's obvious favorite, Jack became an increasingly self-contained and independent child. When he learned to read, he positively lost himself in books. He enjoyed histories and biographies, from which tales of great civilizations and heroic deeds inspired him. He particularly loved to read and reread the tales of King Arthur, his Knights of the Round Table, and the legendary Camelot. Rose Kennedy was a devout Catholic, and she wanted her children raised and educated as such. The Kennedys attended Mass regularly at St. Aidan's Church in Brookline and observed daily prayers at home together as a family. Rose ensured that all of the Kennedy children carried rosaries and all underwent confirmation in the church once they reached adolescence. The eldest Kennedy children attended the nearby Edward Devotion School during their elementary school years. Both Joe Sr. and Rose were the grandchildren of Irish immigrants. Though the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds had moved up significantly in the world since the mid-19th century, anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment continued to permeate Boston, especially at the highest social and economic echelons. Joe Sr.'s father, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, and Rose's father, John F. Fitzgerald, for whom Jack was named, had both achieved success in local politics and business despite the pervasive discrimination against Irish Catholics and their own fairly humble beginnings. P.J. Kennedy even did well enough to send his son Joseph to Harvard. Though both of their families had achieved a great deal of success in just 2 generations, Joe Sr. grew weary of the persistent "no Irish need apply" signs, which continued to marginalize Boston's Irish population for housing and jobs while also barring them from social clubs and events reserved for elite white Protestants. When Jack was 10 years old, Joe Sr. and Rose moved the family from Brooklyn, Massachusetts, to the New York City borough known as the Bronx. The move to New York was also partly in response to a shift in Joe Sr.'s business activities. It allowed him to be closer to Wall Street, thus facilitating the greater ease of managing his finance and property concerns. He began to make regular business trips to Los Angeles as well, where he had purchased several failing film companies and amalgamated them into the highly successful RKO Pictures. Nettie were both traditionalists to whom family was all important, but their marriage was in no way perfect. Joe Sr. regularly had extramarital affairs throughout much of their life together. Because divorce was frowned upon at best and was especially taboo for Catholics, Rose was forced to find her own ways of coping with her husband's unfaithfulness. Joe Sr. often had affairs with women he met in his professional life, such as secretaries and actresses. He carried on an affair for some years with the celebrated actress Gloria Swanson, whom he even invited home to visit his family. One can only imagine the grace and dignity Rose had to call upon in order to behave as a warm and welcoming hostess to her husband's mistress. Throughout her marriage to Joseph Kennedy, Rose regularly took short vacations by herself, often with her sisters or a few close friends. These trips likely provided some respite from the demands of her increasingly visible public position as Mrs. Joseph Kennedy, as well as being the mother of 9 children, the oldest of whom was barely into his mid-teens. Despite her husband's constant womanizing, Rose Kennedy remained stoic. She never outwardly acknowledged Joseph's philandering or spoke of the pain it undoubtedly gave her. The fact that Joseph Kennedy was an active and engaged husband and father when he was present may have provided some salve to the sting of his infidelities. The Kennedys did not allow their children to be lazy and dream away their weekends or school vacations. Joe Sr. and Rose always had a full itinerary of family activities during holidays. Sometimes they went to the theater or to parties, but many neighbors and friends of the Kennedys who lived near their summer retreat at Hyannisport, Massachusetts, recalled that the family stayed home together more often than not. This was not, they said, because their neighbors refused to invite them, but because the family genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Importantly, family time was treated as an opportunity for teaching and parenting. Whether it was football, golf, sailing, swimming, or after-dinner charades, the Kennedys treated every activity as intensely adversarial, as an opportunity for glory. "We want no losers in this family," Joe Sr. once told his children. "Only winners." Achieving second or third place meant nothing. Weekend visitors to the family's Hyannisport estate joked that even touch football was a bloody affair when one played with the Kennedys. As well as high academic and career achievement, Joseph and Rose Kennedy stressed the importance of one's personal contribution to society, a notion which seems jarring set against the backdrop of the extraordinary economic privilege of which the Kennedys, as one of the wealthiest families in the United States by the mid-20th century, are a prime example. Joe Sr. amassed enormous wealth throughout the course of his career, and each of his children inherited a trust fund which guaranteed them a fabulously luxurious lifestyle regardless of the careers they chose. Nonetheless, it is clear that all of the Kennedy children absorbed their parents' early lessons of the importance of being a force for good in society, for most of them went on to have impressive and consequential careers in public service. Jack's health was always delicate, even as a child. Though he was athletic and strong, as his father and elder brother Joe encouraged and coached him to be, Jack was always underweight and had frequent digestive problems, colds, and bacterial or viral infections. He suffered through scarlet fever, chickenpox, whooping cough, and measles, all before the age of 10. He averaged about 2 lengthy hospital stays per year throughout his youth for one mysterious ailment or another, whether it was infections, hives, jaundice, terrible stomach pains, or dramatic weight loss. He had been misdiagnosed with various illnesses ranging from blood disorders to leukemia. Eventually, his doctors would discover that ulcerative colitis was at least partly responsible for his constant digestive problems. In his late 20s, an English doctor finally diagnosed him with Addison's disease, an endocrine disorder. Recent medical literature posits that Kennedy's condition may have contributed to a general failure of his autoimmune function, with wide-ranging impacts on his overall health. Stoic like his mother, Jack learned early on to quietly cope with pain and illness. His toughness manifested itself in the development of a dark, fatalistic sense of humor. Rather than complain or lapse into depression, he made fun of himself and his situation. His letters to family and friends during his many periods of convalescence describe embarrassing and painful examinations by an endless parade of doctors, which Jack painted in hilarious and often crude terms. Self-deprecation was his defense against those who might pity him. While he was away at boarding school in Canterbury, Massachusetts, in the spring of 1931, Jack suffered the pain of appendicitis for nearly 2 days before finally being hospitalized for an appendectomy. His parents brought him home to New York for the last 2 months of the school year to recover. In the autumn, Jack was sent to Choate, a Connecticut preparatory academy that was a well-known feeder school for the Ivy League. Joseph Kennedy had acquiesced to his wife's insistence that their children attend Catholic parochial schools for their elementary education, but insisted that his sons at least should attend public secular institutions for secondary school and college, well aware of the anti-Catholic feeling that still permeated American institutions and ambitious that his sons might launch successful political careers. Joseph Kennedy was adamant that Joe Jr. and Jack attend schools which the white Protestant elite viewed as prestigious. The Kennedy daughters, however, all received their secondary educations at Catholic convent schools. At Choate, Jack's childhood fascination with tales of great civilizations and heroic figures began to mature into a lifelong interest in history, politics, and government. Kennedy's biographers disagree about the extent to which a career in politics was what Jack really wanted. He and his brother Joe Jr. certainly experienced pressure from their father to achieve such ambitions. Jack's more recent biographers believe that for him, however, the interest in government and statecraft was both his own and genuine. Jack was not a particularly good student, at least not in the ways his parents and teachers expected him to be. He was always late. He was invariably sloppy, often showing up to class in rumpled clothes and odd socks, his school tie askew. His roommate and his housemaster both complained that his room was always a disastrous mess. To top it all off, Jack's sense of humor was far too irreverent to please the authority figures around him. Throughout his academic career at Choate, Jack achieved no more than a C average. All this, however, seemed to be no yardstick of the young man's ability or promise. Joe Jr., who was 2 years ahead of Jack at Choate, achieved much better grades than his younger brother. He was a star athlete and had a much better behavior record. However, Jack's teachers perceived his natural intelligence and intuited that he might be an outstanding student if only he would apply himself. He was blessed with the ability to read a text and to grasp and contextualize all of its implications quickly. His memory was first-rate, and his powers of recall from a single reading were impressive. He had a highly developed and artful vocabulary for his age, and despite his poor spelling and poor use of punctuation, he was an excellent writer. He was exceptionally creative and imaginative in ways his brother was not. Jack's instructors noted he was especially adept at English and history, both subjects which interested him enough that he achieved grades in the upper 70s and low 80s, unlike his scores in math, sciences, or foreign languages, subjects in which he usually scored in the mid-60s. Though he was hardly CHO's most impressive scholar, he was nonetheless well liked by his fellow students and even most of his teachers. What most of his peers remembered about Jack was his charm and affability. Handsome and charismatic, with a winning smile and a quick wit, even the faculty and school staff couldn't help but like him, even though he could be a handful. As an insecure young man just outgrowing his shyness and trying to stand out from his accomplished older brother, their father's favorite, Jack became something of a rebel. A psychologist whom Jack saw briefly during his CHO years believed that Jack failed to work hard because the thought of competing with his brother and failing was too much to face. One of the many benefits Jack gained from attending Choate was the opportunity to come out of his shell as well as his brother's shadow. Far from continuing to be the quiet and isolated bookworm he had been in childhood, he soon made a tight circle of friends. One of them was his roommate, Lem Billings, with whom Jack remained friends all his life. Jack and his school chums called themselves the Muckers Club. The name was coined by the school's headmaster, who had given the whole student body a dressing gown for the latest practical joke Jack and his pals had dreamed up. Holding up a broken toilet seat, which had evidently been exploded with a firecracker, the headmaster warned them that he would find the muckers that had so brazenly disrespected their school. On another occasion, the Muckers Club had stolen a life-size cardboard cutout of the film star Mae West from a local movie theater and put it in their housemaster's bed. The group even had lapel pins made with an engraving of a shovel and the initial CMC, or Choate Muckers Club, engraved on them. The boys came very close to expulsion in their second year, a threat that was rescinded once their headmaster had calmed down. Jack successfully completed his studies at CHO in the summer of 1935. Though he graduated in the middle of his class, his fellow students voted him most likely to succeed. Though his high school grades had been less than impressive, Jack did quite well on his college entrance exams to Harvard and Princeton, earning scores in the 80s for both tests. He gained admission to both universities for the 1935 to 1936 school year and happily selected Princeton since a number of his school friends from CHOT, including Lem Billings, were starting there in September as well. Joseph Kennedy intended for Jack to first spend a semester studying under Harold Laski at the London School of Economics, as his brother Joe Jr. had. But Jack's continuing ill health brought him back to the States within a month. He managed to enroll late at Princeton, but even this was too much for him, and he was once again hospitalized just 2 months later. Since returning in the middle of the school year was not an option once Jack recovered, Joseph Kennedy decided to send his son to Europe. Jack spent the late spring and the whole summer wandering through Europe, experiencing what is now called a gap year before beginning his first year of college. In the autumn of 1936, Jack began his studies at Harvard, his father's alma mater, as Joseph Kennedy had hoped he would. During his first few years at Harvard, Jack hardly seemed to take his studies and academic record more seriously than he had at CHO. A gentleman's C average, which had also been characteristic of Joseph Kennedy's own performance when he attended Harvard, seemed to be good enough for Jack. During his early college years, he seemed far more interested in the sports and social opportunities offered at the college. He joined the football and swim teams. He had a close-knit group of friends at Harvard, some of them from his CHOT days, and they often went to movies and parties together. Jack also developed his well-known reputation with women during these years. Ugh, he rarely had a steady girlfriend. Jack's handsomeness, charisma, and intelligence ensured that he always had a date for every social occasion. Like his father, Jack developed a reputation for inveterate skirt chasing and many affairs, behavior which Joe Sr. approved and encouraged in his letters to his young son. However, Jack's reputation with women was really only prevalent among people in the know and did not become public knowledge until the decades following his death. Jack's latter years at Harvard were far more productive and impressive. His senior thesis, entitled Appeasement in Munich, was highly regarded by his professors, and he made the dean's list in his senior year. He later reworked his thesis into a book, which he published commercially under the title Why England Slept, which became an instant bestseller and attracted significant critical acclaim. It was one of the first and most thorough explanations available to the public of English political developments in the 1930s that had led the nation into World War II. This impressive turnabout in Jack's academic achievement was no doubt due to a change in his educational environment. During 1938 and 1939, Jack was in Europe for several stretches of 3 or more months, watching the very events he chronicled in his thesis unfold. The entire Kennedy family spent time in London when Joseph Kennedy was named the U.S. ambassador to the court of St. James. The Kennedys were very well received in London, quickly becoming part of the elite political and social scene and regularly making headlines. Their eldest daughters, Rosemary, Kathleen, and Eunice, all made their debut before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Kik and Eunice worked for the Red Cross. Though the rest of the Kennedys were content to return to the U.S., Kik absolutely fell in love with London and decided to make her home there after her father resigned his position as ambassador. In 1944, she married William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, who sadly was killed in battle 4 months later. As a result of Joe Sr.'s appointment as ambassador, Jack's classroom for much of his last 2 years of college was Europe's political stage on the eve of the Second World War. He had the chance to attend and observe the political process in England and to meet and get to know parliamentarians that he had only ever read about. Most meaningful to Jack was the opportunity to meet and spend time with Winston Churchill, whom he greatly admired for his literary and statecraft achievements. Jack traveled extensively throughout Europe and the Middle East on a fact-finding mission for his father, even crossing the German lines into Czechoslovakia to assess the situation in Prague. The authorities at the American embassy there were less than pleased at having to shepherd this rich man's son through extremely dangerous territory for a mission that seemed little more important than a bureaucratic internship. Yet when they met Jack and had a chance to speak to him about his investigations across the continent, they softened, as many who expected haughty self-importance from a Kennedy tended to do. Jack was fast becoming a serious young man where politics and international affairs were concerned, and his handlers had to admit he was producing reports worthy of an experienced diplomat. He was also unfailingly charming and friendly, with a winningly self-deprecating sense of humor, which made others willing to help him. It was in the process of researching and writing his senior thesis that Jack began to form the basis of the political worldview he would hold all his life. In his last year at Harvard, Jack shifted dramatically from the isolationist position that his father and older brother Joe clung to staunchly. Convinced that they were wrong, Jack now aligned with Franklin Roosevelt in the belief that the United States had a duty to intervene in defense of Europe's beleaguered democracies and occupied states. Jack's political and intellectual differences with his father should not suggest that any particular strain was added to their relationship. In fact, while the two disagreed constantly about politics throughout the rest of their lives together, it never seemed to affect the love and mutual respect between them. By the summer and early fall of 1940, the American isolationist position on the war had begun to shift noticeably, and the first few thousand young men were drafted for military training, Jack among them. Determined to serve should the U.S. ultimately decide to enter the war, but fearful of failing the medical exam, Jack did all he could to keep himself as healthy as possible. He had begun to experience near-constant back pain in his last year at Harvard, owing to injuries sustained playing varsity football. He began an assiduous exercise program to strengthen his back to ensure that he would be accepted for active service when his time came. Unfortunately, his physical health proved to be too problematic. Nonetheless, Joe Sr. managed to pull some strings and procured a desk job in the Naval Intelligence Service for Jack. During the summer of 1941, Joe Jr. shocked his family with his own decision to enlist. Also, though he remained as firmly isolationist as his father, that opinion was rapidly becoming a shameful and unpatriotic notion in the American consciousness. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was publicly criticized more and more frequently for his determination to keep the United States out of the war. Some biographers believe that the family's reputation was a large part of the reason that Joe Jr. voluntarily enlisted to train as a Navy pilot. No newspaper pundit was going to accuse his father or any of the Kennedys of being unpatriotic or unwilling to serve their country in the current global crisis. By 1942, both Joe Jr. and Jack would see frontline action overseas. Despite his continuously delicate health, Jack was determined to serve. That rich and influential men regularly pull strings to ensure that their privileged sons are not drafted into active service in times of war. Joseph Kennedy instead pulled strings to make sure that Jack was appointed to a combat position. Though it terrified him that his two elder sons insisted on venturing into the line of fire, he was nonetheless proud of them and did everything he could to ensure that they could serve honorably as they wished to do. After somehow managing to skirt a thorough medical exam, Jack was given command of a patrol torpedo boat and deployed to the Pacific Theater during the spring of 1942. Jack served with bravery and distinction. He was well liked by the men serving under him, who all described him as warm and friendly, intelligent, and highly capable. Jack's undoubted skill as a lifelong sailor and swimmer served him well during his time in the Navy, especially when disaster struck. On the night of August 1, 1942, Patrol Torpedo Boat 109, commanded by Jack Kennedy, was one of several boats ordered to either blockade or repel the advance of 4 Japanese destroyers bound for the Solomon Islands with fresh troops and supplies. The mission was a failure, with not a single PT boat hitting their target. During the operation, PT-109 was rammed by one of the Japanese destroyers, literally cutting the boat in half. 2 of the crew were killed on impact. The other 11, including Jack, clung to the wreckage of their boat for several hours, waiting for a rescue that never came. Assuming that the crew of PT-109 had almost certainly perished, none of the other PT boats came back for them. Knowing that they would all die at sea if they continued to wait, Jack took action. He told the crew that the only chance they had was to attempt swimming to one of the nearby islands. He organized the men into a column by which the injured, unable to swim, could be towed by those who had not been hurt in the attack. Slowly and painstakingly, throughout the night, Jack led his crew on a 3.5-mile swim to the nearby uninhabited Plum Pudding Island. Though he had seriously re-injured his back during the crash, Jack told no one, continuing to swim and call encouragement to his men. Nonetheless, Jack saved the life of the crew's engineer, who had been badly burned in the collision, towing him to shore with the strap of the engineer's life jacket clenched between his teeth. The crew of PT-109 were incredibly lucky. They were found by a civilian fisherman who carried their request for help to the nearest Allied stronghold. Jack had carved the crew's SOS message and a rough sketch of their geographic location on a coconut shell. Back home in the United States, Joe Kennedy Sr. had spent a week in agony waiting for news. He had been told privately and confidentially about the loss of PT-109 and its missing crew. He kept it to himself, unable to bear the thought of telling his wife and family, clinging to hope that his son and his comrades might yet be found. 7 days after the crash, Jack and his crew were rescued, and the story exploded in the American newspapers. Jack was awarded a Purple Heart for injuries sustained during battle, as well as the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the highest honor awarded for that branch of the American military. Sadly, Joe Jr. was not so lucky. Joe Jr. had served ably and well as a Navy pilot, flying 25 combat missions by the summer of 1944. Though he was due to be sent home, he volunteered instead for Operations Aphrodite and Anvil, an experimental bombing program. Tragically, during the test flight, the bomber's explosives detonated prematurely, killing both Joe Jr. and his co-pilot instantly. The loss of their eldest son was a terrible blow to the entire Kennedy family, not least to Jack, who suspected that Joe had enlisted in the Navy not only for honor's sake but also as part of his ongoing competitive rivalry with Jack. The younger Kennedys were equally grieved. Joe Jr. had always been a loving mentor and a reliable figure in his younger sisters' and brothers' lives. The blow likely fell most cruelly on Joe Sr. and Rose. The death of their first child came upon the heels of another private family tragedy. Their eldest daughter, Rosemary, had begun to regress noticeably in previous years. At 23 years of age, she still attended a convent school, which could give her the kind of attention and personalized instruction she required. But by 1941 or 42, the school staff began to report an increase in frustrated and aggressive behavior in Rosemary. She became physically confrontational with those who made her angry, and she had begun to wander off without telling anyone where she was going. Fearful that Rosemary might eventually cause serious harm to others or to herself, Joe Sr. and Rose sought medical advice on how to help their daughter. The physicians they consulted recommended a frontal lobe lobotomy, a new procedure at the time, which surgeons claimed could put an end to aggressive or antisocial behavioral traits. Trusting that these doctors and surgeons were competent and believing their claims that Rosemary would be much happier and gentler after the procedure, Joe Sr. and Rose consented. The results were utterly tragic. Rosemary lost all of the progress that her mother had painstakingly helped her develop over the years. She had never attained the intellectual capacity for senior school or university study, but she had eventually learned to read and write well enough. After the surgery, she became nearly nonverbal and required constant care for her physical needs for the rest of her life. Rosemary became a shadow of her formerly sweet, loving, and excitable self. Joe Sr. and Rose were utterly devastated by the outcome of Rosemary's treatment and blamed themselves. Joseph insisted that only he should visit Rosemary in the care facility that was to be her new home. And indeed, this remained the case for years afterwards. Rose visited her daughter only once in the next 20 years, while the other Kennedy children were told nothing about what had happened to their sister. Joe Sr. would only say that she was well, that she had many friends, and enjoyed her job teaching young children with similar challenges. In an interview many years later, Eunice Kennedy revealed that she and her younger siblings were not told about Rosemary's lobotomy or resulting tragic condition for decades. Whether or not Jack knew anything about it is still unclear. The loss of Joe Jr. and Rosemary during the years of World War II was the beginning of a series of terrible tragedies that would befall the Kennedys and their descendants throughout the remainder of the 20th century. When he was discharged from active duty, Jack returned home to his family. Joe Sr., who was a close contemporary and friend of the newspaper giant William Randolph Hearst, secured Jack a job as a journalist with Hearst newspapers. Jack traveled to San Francisco to cover the inaugural convention of the newly created United Nations. His writings from this period show that he had his doubts that the reach or effectiveness of the UN would ever be any greater than that wielded by the now obsolete League of Nations. He also saw the creation of a Security Council with broad veto powers as conferring an unfair advantage to already powerful countries, by which they might continue to dominate the rest of the world and thus negate much of the intended spirit of the institution. Jack returned to Europe in the summer of 1945 as an international correspondent covering the Potsdam Conference, where he took a similarly dim view of the proceedings which now divided Europe into two distinct spheres of influence. It was already clear by the end of the war that the United States and the Soviet Union were locked into a trajectory of struggle for geopolitical supremacy. With the economies and infrastructure of so many other countries shattered by the war, Jack knew that only the US and Russia now had the resources or the power to shape the post-war world. After the years he had spent observing and researching the geopolitical configurations of Europe and Asia, he believed that if the world was going to avoid sliding back into brutal authoritarianism or wholesale imperialism, the United States had to embrace internationalism and support nations seeking sovereignty and development in order to keep them from turning to communism or from coming under the direct rule of the Soviet Union. Throughout his subsequent political career, Kennedy remained an avid Cold Warrior. While he was a reasonably talented writer, which he had proven with the publication of his senior thesis and regular editorials for the Harvard Crimson, Jack's real passion clearly lay elsewhere. Some biographers speculate that Jack undertook his subsequent political career mostly under pressure from Joe Sr., who was absolutely determined to see one of his children attain high political office. It does not seem that this was the case, however. Jack remained passionately interested in politics and government throughout his young life, and it seems unlikely that his father had to twist Jack's arm particularly hard, if at all, to urge him to run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Joe Sr. not only managed his son's 1947 congressional campaign, he bankrolled the entire operation, lobbied for political and media support, and promised favors and bribes to those who could help support Jack's candidacy. That being said, the campaign's platform was entirely Jack's brainchild. He may have worked closely with his father on strategy and discussed policy proposals with him and the rest of his campaign team, but ultimately, policy decisions were his alone, and he wrote all of his own speeches with the editorial help of his assistant, Ted Sorensen. The whole Kennedy family contributed in some fashion to the furthering of Jack's political career throughout the following decade. Bobby co-managed Jack's campaigns for the House and Senate along with Joe Sr. His siblings Eunice, Pat, Jean, and Teddy knocked on doors and canvassed for votes. Jack's mother and sisters hosted elegant teas at Boston's most fashionable hotels to lobby hundreds of Democratic women voters on his behalf. This strategy proved a smashing success, securing the love and political loyalty of thousands of women voters. In 1947, at just 29 years old, John F. Kennedy won election to the U.S. House of Representatives, defeating Henry Cabot Lodge in the 11th District of Massachusetts. In 1948, another terrible tragedy befell the Kennedys when they received word that their daughter Kik was killed in a plane crash while on vacation with friends. Jack was utterly devastated. Of all his siblings, he had always been closest to Kik. She was quick and witty like himself. She had always looked up to and admired her older brother, and he in turn trusted her implicitly. Their siblings recalled that Jack and Kik often finished each other's sentences or were caught giggling over private jokes they shared with no one else in the family. When Kik died, Jack's friend Lem Billings recalled, it became that much harder to reach Jack. He had never been very demonstrative with his emotions to begin with, and with his beloved sister gone, he became even more remote emotionally. While he was a loving big brother to all of his younger siblings, the increasingly close relationship he had recently developed with his brother Bobby likely provided some comfort after Kik's passing. There was such a big difference between them in age that the two brothers did not attain a real closeness until Bobby was in his early to mid-20s. Jack and Bobby became best friends when they worked together on Jack's 1947 campaign for the U.S. House of Representatives. From there on, throughout Jack's political career, Bobby would work in lockstep with his brother and their father, managing Jack's campaign for Congress, for the Senate, and eventual. Jack ran for the office of President of the United States, with Bobby serving as Jack's Attorney General and right-hand man. During his tenure as a member of the House and later as a senator for Massachusetts, Jack established political positions and leanings that would come to characterize his entire career. He remained an avid New Dealer in the Roosevelt mold. He voted in favor of strengthening Social Security, building more affordable housing, and establishing rent control. He tended to support pro-labor initiatives and opposed excessive tax relief for large corporations like oil companies. He was also an active advocate for American veterans and worked to improve the provision of housing and job opportunities for them. Additionally, he supported the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Historically, these positions have endeared Kennedy to liberals and progressives, many of whom continue to admire his policy record, writings, and speeches. Other scholars, however, have sought to highlight his seemingly more conservative policy positions and insist that the man himself was not nearly so progressive as his reputation implies. Indeed, Jack took a hardline stance against communism both internationally and domestically. He supported cuts to income taxes and corporate taxes to encourage growth, and he showed a certain weariness for the power of organized labor, all qualities typically associated with an American conservative perspective. Yet Kennedy's worldview was far more nuanced. Despite his stance on communism, Kennedy was no supporter of Joseph McCarthy or of his zealous campaign against suspected communists in the government or the military. Though McCarthy was a friend of Joe Kennedy's, Jack loathed McCarthy personally and thought him dangerous, as many of his colleagues did. But like them, he also feared McCarthy's power over the increasingly anti-communist American public. Further, Jack may have supported lower taxes, free trade, and a strong dollar, but not for the primary benefit of elites or corporations or at the expense of public programs that benefited working people. Finally, his weariness of unions had less to do with the typical conservative fear of organized labor restricting growth than with the potential for unions to hijack the power of the workers they were supposed to represent. In the final estimation, what emerges is not a flaming progressive or a firm conservative. For that matter, Kennedy was a moderate, a pragmatist, and a realist. A close reading of his political speeches, his books, and his academic papers reveals a deep thinker whose policy conclusions were far more complex than the traditional left-wing or right-wing labels typically allow. He rejected the dogmatism that he saw as characteristic of both persuasions and championed an overall outlook on politics, statecraft, and citizenship which he believed could encompass and unite all Americans and perhaps all nations. When he addressed the student body at the 50th anniversary of Choate, his alma mater, he quoted Rousseau, "As soon as any man says of the affairs of state, 'What does it matter to me?' the state may be given up as lost." He urged Choate's students to resist giving in to political cynicism, that American democracy could only survive and prevail if its citizens remained active, engaged, informed, and committed to a collective spirit of public service. He also called for a renewed emphasis on compromise and good faith in political and civic life, insisting that both were utterly essential for effective politics and a cohesive society. Political discourse, he said, might often be adversarial, but it should never be characterized by enmity. Despite his hard work and commitment to his constituents, Jack had the worst attendance record among those members of the 80th Congress of the United States, as his lifelong struggle with illness continued to rear its ugly head. He struggled with malaria, which had remained undiagnosed during the war and which had weakened him greatly. Shortly after his election to Congress, he was finally diagnosed with Addison's disease. Jack's doctors prescribed steroids, which unfortunately complicated his enduring back injuries, contributing to the erosion of a spinal disc and leaving him nearly unable to walk. He continued to struggle with bouts of illness and terrible musculoskeletal pain for the rest of his life. Twice throughout the next 10 years, Jack's condition deteriorated to the point where he was administered the last rites of the church. Each time he recovered to the immense relief of his family and friends. While his ongoing health battles embittered him, he gamely maintained a sense of humor and tried hard to project confidence in himself. These experiences gave him a strong sense of fatalism. Friends and family members recalled that Jack, convinced he would not live past 45 years of age at most, was determined to push himself to achieve, to make his mark upon the world, and contribute something of lasting value. By the time he began his Senate campaign, Jack was 34 years old and still an inveterate bachelor. His aides and assistants despaired over his continued messiness and lack of organization. He still sported a rather casual, even sloppy appearance, with his odd socks and slightly rumpled clothes, but somehow on Jack, the effect was seemingly rakish rather than unkempt. His tousled hair came off as boyish, and his confidence, charm, and affability seemed to help him carry it all off. Still a bachelor in every way, Jack also continued to pursue many affairs. His friends often joked among themselves about the veritable parade of women who seemed to enter and leave Jack's bedroom with the regularity of a palace guard. Women simply loved Jack. He had the ability, a former girlfriend of his noted, to make a woman feel that she had his full attention. He looked you in the eye, she said, asked you questions, and showed a genuine interest in what you thought. He quickly moved on, however, if there seemed to be no. By the time Jack reached his 30s, Joe Sr. began urging his son to get married. If he was serious about a real future in politics, his father warned him it was time to settle down. Public figures who remained unmarried into their 30s or 40s inevitably raised doubts about their seriousness, their maturity, or even about their sexual orientation. Jack had been in and out of love a few times since his college days, but never with anyone suitable, that is, unmarried and Catholic. In the spring of 1951, he met Jacqueline Lee Bouvier at a dinner party. Jackie, Teddy Kennedy recalled, had captivated Jack right away. She was beautiful, but more than this, she had far more substance and intelligence than many of the women he had dated. Jack was immediately interested and asked her if she wanted to go out for a drink with him after dinner. Unfortunately, just at that moment, Jackie's fiancé unexpectedly arrived to take her home. Jack backed off, and it was another year before the two met again at yet another dinner party. By then, Jackie had ended her engagement, and she and Jack soon began dating. She initially kept him at arm's length, a dinner date here, a movie there. While she found him handsome, charming, and quite brilliant, she doubted his commitment. Here, she later said, was a man who didn't seem to want to get married. Jack nonetheless continued to pursue her and gave every indication that he cared about her more and more. He was not the flowers and candy type, Jackie recalled, but gave her books instead. He loved to talk about literature and history with her. Though she was 12 years his junior, just 22 years old and fresh out of college, Jack found her highly intelligent and accomplished. He admired her impressive facility for languages, at which he had never excelled. Jackie spoke French with near-native fluency and was comfortable conversing in Spanish, Italian, and even German to a limited extent. In addition to being smart and beautiful, she was kind, quietly funny, and utterly loyal and devoted to those she loved. Friends of Jack's recalled that the two had bonded over their similar childhoods, in which both had escaped family pressures, clashes, and, in Jack's case, debilitating illness by turning to books and their own inner worlds. In the early spring of 1953, Jack proposed to Jackie, and she accepted. The pair were married on the 12th of September at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Though each loved and admired the other, Jack and Jackie had a difficult marriage, largely owing to Jack's virtual inability to be faithful to one woman, even his wife. For Jackie's part, her husband's many and continued affairs angered and saddened her. Yet the concept of husbandly infidelity was such a ubiquitous part of the culture in which they had both been raised that Jackie, like Rose Kennedy and her own mother before her, learned to ignore it, asking Jack instead for his discretion for the sake of her dignity. An additional strain on their marriage was the long hours Jack worked as a sitting senator. His still active social life aside, Jackie frequently found herself alone well into the evenings. She grew lonely and depressed in the early years of her marriage, a state compounded by the difficulties she and Jack experienced conceiving children. In their first few years together, Jackie suffered a miscarriage 2 years into her marriage, and the following year, she gave birth to a stillborn child, a daughter they had planned to name Arabella. Jack wasn't even there when his wife delivered. He had gone to Europe with friends a mere month before her due date. In 1957, a year after losing Arabella, Jackie gave birth to their daughter Caroline, who was followed in 1960 by a son, John Jr. Caroline and John Jr. were the only children of Jack and Jackie Kennedy to survive to adulthood. Jackie gave birth once again during the summer of 1963 to a son named Patrick, who sadly lived only 2 days. The stresses of their marriage no doubt made their lives together challenging. What seemed to bring them together more than anything else was Jack's ongoing health struggles. He continued to experience one or more gravely serious hospitalizations per year and by the late 50s required multiple potentially life-threatening back surgeries just to stay mobile. Throughout Jack's periods of convalescence, no one was more devoted to him than Jackie, who rarely left his side. By the late 1950s, Jack had reached a political echelon which few, if any, people ever reached before the age of 40. He had amassed more than a decade of experience in politics and government. He had published 2 more highly regarded books since the release of Why England Slept. In 1956, he published Profiles in Courage, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize. In 1958, he published A Nation of Immigrants in partnership with the Anti-Defamation League. In these works, as well as in his speeches in Congress or on the campaign trail, Kennedy had constructed a political ethos and a vision for his country's future which would carry him all the way to the White House by 1960, with his brother Bobby and his wife Jackie at his side helping to manage his campaign. And with his father Joe Sr. at his back advising and financing him, Jack hit the campaign trail in what proved to be one of the most fascinating elections in American history. The employment of media resources was unprecedented, and the election featured the nation's first-ever televised political debates. Carefully coached, naturally photogenic, and now significantly more polished thanks to the influence of his wife Jackie and her legendary sense of style, Jack Kennedy made a far more favorable impression on television than his Republican opponent, Richard Nixon. Some commentators have insisted that Nixon's performance in the debate was more substantive than Kennedy's, but that his tendency to speak to the reporters and not the camera, as well as his noticeably sweaty countenance, weakened his effectiveness. In the television medium, Kennedy's charisma in that first televised debate sent him rising in the polls. In the end, John F. Kennedy took 303 Electoral College votes to Nixon's 219, winning him the presidency, though he secured the popular vote by less than 1% over his rival. JFK, as he has become known, was the youngest president ever elected to the White House at just 43 years old, as well as the first Catholic. Jack's presidency is a storied one in American history and popular culture. Though it lasted less than 1,000 days, rarely had so much tumultuous change been set in motion so rapidly in such a short period of time. During the scant 3 years of his presidency, Jack's administration confronted and helped overcome the gravest threat ever faced by Cold War America with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He sponsored extensive and varied legislation and laid the groundwork for broad domestic reforms, which would see their full fruition in the subsequent presidency of Lyndon Johnson. In terms of foreign policy, Kennedy adopted a multifaceted approach that mixed diplomacy with decisive action. Though a committed Cold Warrior, he believed that the U.S. could forestall the spread of communism by extending a hand to developing nations or those seeking sovereignty and independence on their own terms. Kennedy established multiple foreign aid and development organizations to achieve these aims in Africa and Latin America, including Food for Peace, the Alliance for Progress, and the Peace Corps. His early attempts to lower Cold War tensions in talks with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev over a divided Berlin were largely unsuccessful. The military buildup and nuclear arms race, which began under Eisenhower, initially accelerated under Kennedy. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union seemed willing to be the first to begin disarmament or to allow transparency regarding their nuclear arsenals. The Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-backed coup of Fidel Castro's Cuba, which Kennedy's administration inherited from the Eisenhower White House, was ultimately a failure. Khrushchev responded with the installation of infrastructure for ballistic nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The ensuing Cuban Missile Crisis, during which U.S. naval forces established a blockade to prevent the delivery of the missiles, was the closest the world came to a potentially devastating nuclear exchange since the end of the Second World War. To Kennedy's and Khrushchev's mutual credit, they were able to secure a diplomatic solution whereby the Soviets would remove all nuclear infrastructure from Cuba and the U.S. would dismantle their nuclear infrastructure in Turkey, where missiles were positioned for strikes on Russia. A direct telephone line was established between Kennedy and Khrushchev following this episode, and Cold War tensions began to lessen considerably. The Cuban Missile Crisis had badly shaken Kennedy and considerably altered his perspective on the Cold War, spurring him to change tactics and pursue the first nuclear test ban treaty with Soviet Russia. One area of Cold War competition that would be allowed to continue was the newly formed NASA and its Apollo program. Though he would not live to see Neil Armstrong walk on the moon, one of the things Kennedy is most remembered for is laying the groundwork and instilling the confidence in the American people to launch a new age of space exploration. Historians are divided on Kennedy's domestic policy record. While some emphasize his failure to enact a majority of his New Frontier agenda items during his 3-year stint in the White House, others point out that those proposals that did not achieve passage during Kennedy's tenure were subsequently passed during Johnson's presidency. Still, an impressive amount of legislation was initiated by the Kennedy administration, including reforms in education, labor, healthcare, social welfare, and taxation. Between 1961 and 1963, corporate taxes and income taxes across all brackets were lowered to encourage growth and consumer spending. Social Security was bolstered, food stamps were reintroduced, revitalization schemes were launched in economically depressed areas, the minimum wage was raised, collective bargaining power was strengthened, and educational funding was increased. Social reforms also received increasingly pointed attention over time from the Kennedy White House, including civil rights. 1962 saw the establishment of the Commission on the Status of Women, which investigated and reported on women's inequality in areas such as education, employment, and political representation. One area of domestic policy in which Kennedy evolved considerably throughout his presidency was civil rights. Though he initially seemed rather non-committal to the more activist sections of the movement for black equality, such as the Freedom Riders, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Kennedy's perspective and his willingness to act grew throughout his time in the White House. His struggles with Southern segregationists, who refused to integrate public universities even under orders of the Supreme Court, as well as the horrendous violence perpetrated on peaceful protesters, such as that carried out in Selma, Alabama, spurred him to take a firmer and far more public stance against racial hatred in America. Initially nervous when he heard about the imminent March on Washington in 1963, he was instead inspired and overcome as he watched Dr. Martin Luther King give his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech on a live telecast of the rally. Immediately after the march, Jack received Dr. King and the other organizers at the White House to congratulate them and discuss their policy goals. Though Kennedy's presidency was relatively short, it left an indelible mark on the American collective consciousness. Despite the tumultuous times, many Americans remember the Kennedy presidency as a time of hope. Hope and optimism. The president was a relatively young, handsome, funny, and charismatic man with a beautiful, accomplished, and stylish wife and young children. The Kennedys were exceptionally media-savvy, projecting a wholesome family atmosphere with more than a touch of glamour, which seemed to be the most salient characteristics in glossy magazine spreads and carefully edited newsreels. In fitting fashion, considering Jack's childhood fascination with the tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, the Kennedy White House was known as Camelot. Kennedy's youth and the hope for the future that he represented for so many made the events of November 22, 1963, utterly devastating for millions of Americans. Jack and Jackie had traveled together to Dallas for talks with two fractious camps of Texas Democrats. As the President, the First Lady, and Texas Governor Nelson Connally and his wife rode through the plaza in downtown Dallas in an open convertible, waving to the assembled crowds and smiling, a young veteran named Lee Harvey Oswald had quietly taken position at a window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, a rifle in hand. At approximately 12:30 p.m., Oswald fired 3 shots into the President's motorcade. Jack was struck in the back and then in the back of the head. He was rushed to a local hospital and pronounced dead by 1 o'clock that afternoon. Oswald was later arrested for Kennedy's murder, claiming that he was a patsy for others who wanted the president dead. 2 days later, while Oswald was being transferred from his jail cell to a courtroom for his arraignment, he was shot and killed by a local club owner named Jack Ruby. Lyndon Johnson, who as vice president had assumed the presidency upon Kennedy's death, instituted the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. The committee members concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, but these findings provided no check on the growth of conspiracy theories, which persist to this day. Suppositions abound as to the so-called real killers, which have included the CIA, military defense contractors, Southern segregationists, or even his successor, Lyndon Johnson. Although subsequent committees continued to find fairly thin evidence to support the possibility of a conspiracy, the overwhelming majority of the American public continued to doubt that Kennedy's killer acted alone. Kennedy's assassination was the beginning of major disillusionment in American politics, one that has contributed ever since to the steady erosion of public trust in government. The body of John F. Kennedy lay in state for one day at the White House and then for another at the Capitol building, where hundreds of thousands lined up for hours to pass through and pay their respects. His funeral was held on the 25th of November at St. Matthew's Church in Washington, D.C., and Kennedy was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. Historian and friend of John F. Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., once noted that more than any others, for events defined the American experience in the 20th century, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the death of Franklin Roosevelt, NASA's 1969 moon landing, and the assassination of JFK. Each of these events shook the American people to their core, fundamentally shifting both their national trajectory and their own sense of themselves as Americans. The story of the life of John F. Kennedy unfolded against the backdrop of the most consequential historical events in 20th century America. He was born during the Great War, came of age, and fought for his country during the Second World War. Until his life and presidency were tragically cut short, he stood at the pinnacle of power in the United States and attempted to guide his people through the hottest part of the decades-long Cold War. He died at the very beginning of a period of dramatic social and cultural change. In many ways, it was JFK's memory and the remembrance of his stated ideals that helped to drive such change forward in the United States. To this day, he is consistently ranked in multiple polls as being among the top 10 best U.S. presidents in history. It is ironic that while so much is known about him, the real Jack remains rather shadowy. He has naturally inspired a slew of biographies, but few could be called truly comprehensive, despite the sheer breadth of documentary evidence available, especially considering the wealth of information which has been declassified in recent years. Jack lived an absurdly full and eventful life despite it being cut short. Perhaps it is because Jack was so iconic, so larger than life, that a clearer picture of the man continues to elude us. But just what was it that made Kennedy so iconic and that continues to place him among the ranks of American history's greatest presidents? Was it his record as a war hero or his impressive intelligence and facility with words, as shown in his memorable writings and inspirational speeches? Was it his undoubted charisma and magnetism? Was it partly due to the fact that his virtues were heartily extolled and his flaws and failings, which are characteristic of all people, were well concealed until long after his death? Was it the timing of his ascension to the presidency at such a uniquely dramatic period of international political and social change? Or was it perhaps simply that he was tragically struck down at such a young age and right at the beginning of what many believed would be a season of hope and optimism for their country? This last supposition may strike closest to the truth. For while a good deal of positive change followed JFK's presidency, the United States also went on to lose tens of thousands of young men in an expanded conflict in Vietnam under President Johnson. For more major assassinations of prominent figures pursuing broad political and social change occurred between 1963 and 1968, including Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Jack's own brother Bobby Kennedy. Finally, a new conservative tide rose with the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, heralding the arrival of a backlash against the more liberal and progressive reforms of the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies. A tide that has continued to alternately rise and ebb in the decades since and to heighten polarization with each political shift. In contrast to the largely positive view on JFK himself, his presidency and legacy, his critics point to numerous areas and decisions which could be said to mar his personal and political record. These include his decision to launch the Bay of Pigs invasion, his failure to come to a détente with Nikita Khrushchev over the division of Berlin, which ultimately resulted in the erection of the Berlin Wall, bringing into reality the most tangible realization of the Iron Curtain. This lack of a détente with the Soviet premier can also be said to have increased the likelihood of the Cuban Missile Crisis occurring, which could have brought the world to a nuclear apocalypse. As well as this, the U.S. support for the coup to oust and assassinate the South Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem, ultimately resulted in the weakening of South Vietnam and its eventual defeat. On the domestic front, his dropping of import duties to promote international trade could be said to have weakened American industry through the proliferation of cheaper foreign imports, while his notorious affairs and extramarital liaisons undermine his image as a family man and lead to questions over his moral integrity. What do you think of John F. Kennedy? Would he be regarded with the same reverence had he not been assassinated in 1963, or was he a flawed president and human being who was made a martyr by Lee Harvey Oswald? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Svetoslav Molotov was born, according to the Julian calendar, on the 25th of February, 1890, in the village of Kuchara in the Vyatka Governorate region of Russia, on the west side of the Ural Mountains, still theoretically in Europe, though hundreds of kilometers east of St. Petersburg and Moscow. His baptismal name was Svetoslav Mikhaevich Scriabin. Molotov was a pen name he would adopt in later life. Because of the changing calendar systems used in Russia in the first decades of his life, Sviatoslav's date of birth is also often given as the 9th of March, 1890, according to the Gregorian calendar, which was in use throughout most of Europe, though not yet in Russia. A development which also creates the unusual situation where the October Revolution of 1917 happened in what was November in most other European countries. Vyacheslav's father was Mikhail Scriabin, a local shop worker in Kuchara. His mother was Anna Scriabin. She came from a relatively affluent family of grocers, and Mikhail worked his way up through her family's business. Vyacheslav was the 9th of 10 children they would have, 3 of whom died in infancy. The Scriabin family were of above-average means while Svetoslav was growing up, though even a relatively affluent family in rural Vyatka in the late 19th century did not live particularly well by modern standards. Young Svetoslav was first sent to school in the town of Nolinsk. Here, he was a gifted pupil of clearly above-average intellect, though shy and retiring. In his spare time, he helped out in the family business and became a precocious reader of books and pamphlets on social and political matters in Europe and Russia. As he grew up, the perception of him was of an uptight individual, but one who would become a very efficient administrator and organizer. Skills which propelled him to the forefront of Russian politics over time. Behind the visage of a seemingly inoffensive individual, who dressed sharply but attracted little fanfare, was a young man with strong ambitions peering out from his ever-present spectacles. Molotov's political awakening within this extremely tense Russian political atmosphere came early, in 1906, when he was still just a teenager. He developed an association with the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a radical Russian socialist party which was gaining in strength in the aftermath of the 1905 revolution in Russia, an abortive revolution which had resulted from political repression and the disastrous Russo-Japanese War. This had led Tsar Nicholas II to promise political reforms and the creation of a Russian Duma or parliament, only to try everything possible afterward to block reform of the autocratic system. The Social Democratic Labour Party was the forerunner of the Russian Communist Party and would later split into two factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks being the more radical and aggressive faction, and one which would increasingly come to be led by Vladimir Lenin while he was in exile in Western Europe in the 1900s and into the 1910s. Vyacheslav gravitated over time towards the more radical Bolsheviks. He began writing for the party in the late 1900s. It was in this capacity that he adopted the pen name Molotov that he would forevermore become known by. Molotov derives from the Russian word Malay, meaning hammer, giving his adopted name an industrial sound and also a sense of a person who aimed to break down political conventions in a revolutionary manner. It was not unusual for revolutionary writers during this time to adopt pen names in this way. Lenin himself adopted his own name most likely from the river Lena. Molotov's revolutionary activities initially played out in the Kazan region, where he operated under the pseudonym Dyadia, meaning uncle, in order to avoid detection by the Tsarist secret police. Before long, he was responsible for organizing the activities of the Kazan Revolutionary Youth Wing of the Bolsheviks there. Through these, he was involved in disseminating revolutionary ideas from the writings of Marx, Engels, and Russian Marxists, in groups of young revolutionaries that met clandestinely. He did not long avoid detection, and in the spring of 1909, he was arrested by the state security services and was exiled to Vologda province, where he spent the next 2 years, primarily in the town of Torma, a small town away from any railway lines where the internal exiles could be closely monitored. He continued his studies while here and passed his exams such that when his 2 years of exile ended, he was able to attend the Polytechnical Institute in St. Petersburg. There, he quickly returned to his work with the Bolsheviks, writing frequent contributions for the journal Zvezda, meaning star. He later contributed to the founding and early publications of the more well-known Bolshevik revolutionary journal Pravda, meaning truth. It was while working as part of the editorial and writing team for Pravda that he first met Joseph Stalin, a young Georgian revolutionary, and would have entered into correspondence with Leon Trotsky, a Jewish Russian intellectual who was living in exile like Lenin. Molotov himself continued to suffer persecution and frequent arrests in the Russian capital, culminating in his exile again in 1915, this time to Kutsk, in the desolate Russian East. Though sentenced to 3 years of internal exile here on this occasion, in 1916, he escaped and headed back westward to Kazan and the Volga region. Molotov's life course would be profoundly shaped by the events of the mid-1910s, as it would be for so many Russians and Eastern Europeans during the 20th century. The Russian Empire was critical in the outbreak of the First World War. It was Russian support for the autonomy of the Kingdom of Serbia in the face of Austrian demands to be allowed to enter Serbian territory, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serb nationalist, which circuitously led to the outbreak of a pan-European war in the final days of July and first days of August 1914. When the conflict came, Russia was very badly prepared for it and incurred a major defeat to Germany at the Battle of Tannenberg within weeks of the outbreak of the conflict. Things did not improve much thereafter. In particular, in the course of 1916 and into early 1917, the Russian front in Eastern Europe, where Tsar Nicholas II had taken the decision to command the army himself, collapsed. Around this time, this led to a revolution in St. Petersburg and Moscow in February 1917, one which began the overthrow of the old imperial system. Though the February Revolution was not led by radicals like the Bolsheviks, what it did do is create an environment in which the communists and various other groups began contemplating how they might seize power themselves in the highly fluid political situation in Russia in 1917. By the time the February Revolution occurred, Molotov was already back in St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd to avoid using the overly German-sounding St. Petersburg during the war with Germany. Here he returned to his work with Pravda during a period of immense change in the Bolshevik party operations. Figures like Lenin, Trotsky, and the other party leaders who had been in exile for many years were making their way back to Russia from Western and Central Europe, often actively supported by the German government, which was anxious to sow further instability in the Russian Empire. Over the next half a year, figures like Molotov were involved in forming Soviets, or workers' governing councils, in cities like Petrograd and Moscow, while also trying to plan the overthrow of the conservative revolutionaries that had come to power through the February Revolution. There was a constant fear of arrest and internment, and sometimes individuals had to disappear to Helsinki to avoid arrest. Overall, Molotov, in association with Stalin and several other members of the Bolshevik Petrograd Committee, was central in preparing Red Guard paramilitaries in the Petrograd factories, in preparation for the impending attempt by the Bolsheviks to seize power from the conservative government. The October Revolution was launched by the Bolsheviks in Petrograd on the 25th of October, 1917, according to the Julian calendar which was in use in Russia at that time, whereas most of Europe by then was operating under the new-style Gregorian calendar, according to which the start date of the revolution was the 7th of November. Just over 2 weeks earlier, the Petrograd Soviet had, under the influence of Leon Trotsky, voted for military action in protest against the course of the broader Russian Revolution since the spring. The interim regime in the capital was well aware that unrest was imminent and had moved to shut down the offices, newspapers, and the main transport routes in and out of the city on the 24th of October. Not to be dissuaded, the Bolshevik Red Guards began occupying government buildings across the city on the 25th, and the Winter Palace, the seat of government, was taken over the following day. By the end of the 27th of October, Petrograd, Minsk, Novgorod, Kazan, Ekaterinburg, and Samara were all under the control of the local workers' Soviets, though it was not until the 2nd of November that Moscow came under the control of the Bolsheviks after more than a week of intense fighting. The conflict in Moscow foreshadowed the Russian Civil War to come and indicated that the Bolshevik seizure of power would not be as straightforward across the vast country and empire as it had been in Petrograd and several other industrial cities in the West. Molotov was in Petrograd when the revolution began on the 25th of October and played a key role in directing the Red Guards there and organizing propaganda efforts. He was in the capital to witness the unfolding of the Russian Civil War, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. The initial seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in October 1917 was not a decisive one. While the Communists had claimed control of a number of major cities and formed workers' Soviets that would form the backbone of a new regime, they were not in control of vast parts of Russia, the largest country on earth, large proportions of which were only thinly controlled by the central government at the best of times. There were a great many groups which were opposed to the drift toward a more radical regime, not least the aristocratic and business classes, which were also supported strongly by the foreign governments of Britain, France, and the United States, none of which wanted the specter of a radical socialist regime in power in Petrograd and Moscow. Many other groups opposed the Bolsheviks for other reasons. Some were Mensheviks, some were regional interest groups such as the Cossacks of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and a great many were nationalists in parts of the Russian Empire like Finland, Estonia, and Poland. In the Russian Civil War which now began, and which would claim around a quarter of the number of people that died in the whole of the First World War, the Bolsheviks became known as the Reds, while the broad coalition of opponents to them were the Whites. There were a great many fronts stretching from the Pacific port of Vladivostok in the east to clashes with Finnish, Polish, and Ukrainian partisans in the west. Molotov was no soldier and did not play a frontline role in the Russian Civil War as a commander or general. He did play an important organizational and propaganda role, though. Early in 1918, just weeks after the October Revolution had seen the Bolsheviks claim power in both Petrograd and Moscow, he was appointed as chairman of the Council of National Economy in the Petrograd region. In this capacity, he played an important part in the nationalization of factories in one of the few parts of the burgeoning Soviet Union that had been extensively industrialized for many years. Much of this involved training workers how to run the factories which were now coming under collective ownership. The following year, he took part in a voyage down the river Volga, in which party members such as Molotov aimed to inform people from Moscow south to the Caspian Sea of the new benefits of communist rule. In the course of 1920, as the Soviets began to turn the tide in the Civil War, he served as chairman of the provincial executive in the Nizhny Novgorod region and later oversaw the industrialization of Donetsk and surrounding areas. A sign of his growing importance in the regime was his election late in 1920 as secretary of the Communist Party in the Ukrainian Soviet. In 1921, with the Bolsheviks finally moving towards victory in the Civil War, though with the loss of extensive territory in the West, specifically Finland, Estonia, and Poland, Molotov was elected as a secretary of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party, thus bringing him more clearly into the central leadership of the Soviet Union. He also became a junior member of the Politburo, though without voting rights in the latter body at this juncture. These followed in 1924. Molotov's entry into the central leadership necessarily brought him into the factional struggle that was developing at the top of the emerging Soviet state. There was no doubt that Lenin would be the Soviet Union's first leader when the October Revolution commenced in 1917. But before long, his health problems were becoming all too apparent, and a battle to succeed him was developing. It soon became evident that there were just two realistic candidates, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Molotov moved towards Stalin in this succession contest. His relationship with Trotsky seems to have been especially strained, though one particular anecdote of an interaction between them in the early 1920s is revelatory of Molotov's outlook, and was prescient of the future. During an argument between the pair, Molotov, responding to a sarcastic comment made towards him by Trotsky, rounded on Lenin's possible successor and rebuked him by saying, "Very well, Comrade Trotsky, we can all be geniuses, but we shall see who lasts the longest." For Molotov, politics was sometimes a game of survival, not always of overt intellect. He would survive far longer in it than Trotsky. By 1922, as Lenin's health deteriorated quickly, Stalin was leveraging his position as General Secretary of the Bolsheviks to put himself in a better position to succeed him as leader of the Soviet Union, which was completing the final stages of its victorious campaign in the Civil War. Molotov was effectively deputizing for Stalin as second secretary, and he firmly tied his mass to the Georgian who he had met so many years earlier in pre-revolutionary Georgia. Lenin died in January 1924 after having previously fallen into a coma. A more open power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky followed, one in which Molotov unsurprisingly continued to support Stalin, though he was critical of some of Stalin's views and conduct early on. This all occurred gradually. But by 1926, Stalin had completely outflanked Trotsky, gaining the support of the majority of the members of the Politburo, a process which accounts in part for the promotion of Molotov as a member thereof with full voting rights, who would support Stalin. Trotsky was removed from the Politburo that year and, in 1929, was exiled entirely from the Soviet Union, having already been sent into internal exile the previous year. Years later, after settling in Mexico and continuing to promote a purer form of Marxism abroad, Trotsky was assassinated in 1940. Despite the turbulence of the years of the Russian Civil War, Molotov married and started a family during the 1920s. During the revolution, he had met Paulina Solomonovna Zemchuzina, born Pearl Solomon Karapovskaya, a Jewish Russian woman who was a committed communist revolutionary herself and would rise to a fairly senior position within the Food Commissariat in the 1930s. She later adopted the name Paulina, a more Russified version of Pearl. She and Vyacheslav married in 1920, and she elected not to leave the Soviet Union for the British Mandate in Palestine, as several members of her family did during the 1920s. Her relationship with Molotov was remarked upon by many contemporaries, who viewed Vyacheslav as being dominated by his wife, though it could conversely be argued that theirs was simply a relatively equal relationship of considerable mutual admiration, one in which Paulina was simply more outwardly expressive than her reserved husband. Later, the contemporary criticism of the union would have very real consequences for both Molotov and his wife. They adopted a daughter named Sonia in 1929 and might have been surprised when Paulina finally fell pregnant not long afterwards, resulting in a biological daughter named Svetlana in 1930. Molotov was rewarded by Stalin for his support in the clash with Trotsky and his supporters with a succession of promotions to positions of increasing importance. In 1926, he was sent to Petrograd, which had long since been renamed Leningrad in honor of Stalin's predecessor, to oversee the dismantling of the support base of Grigory Zinoviev, a former ally of Stalin's that the new head of the Soviet Union now turned on as soon as Trotsky was out of the way. This done, in 1928, Molotov was placed in charge of the Communist Party in Moscow and reformed it over the next year. There, he delivered several speeches on the need to rapidly industrialize Russia's cities and towns, and was part of his involvement in the first five-year plan for agricultural collectivization and industrial development, which was launched by Stalin in 1928, and which Molotov played a part in both devising and implementing. Finally, in December 1930, Molotov was appointed to the position of chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Soviet Union, the position which Lenin had held prior to his death. Because of the peculiar structure of power holding in the Soviet Union, it could be argued that this theoretically made him the head of state for the next 11 years, though in reality, power within the government from the mid-1920s onwards rested in Stalin's hands as General Secretary of the Communist Party. Nevertheless, the appointment of Molotov as chairman is indicative of how high he had risen within the Soviet Union by the beginning of the 1930s. The decade that followed would leave immense stains on Molotov's legacy. Two issues above all, his roles in the Soviet famine of the early 1930s and the Great Purge, stand out as particular black marks on his reputation. The Soviet famine of the early 1930s was one of several famines in the Soviet Union between the 1920s and 1940s, one often termed the Holodomor within a specifically Ukrainian context. Between 1930 and 1933, over 5 million people died in Ukraine, southwestern Russia, and other parts of the Soviet Union owing to food shortages brought about by the government's policies. The collectivization of agricultural production, and also the prioritization of food supplies for industrial workers in the cities and towns, led to the disaster. Molotov was deeply implicated in this, traveling in person to Ukraine and the Caucasus to enforce the government's orders to move grain supplies from the countryside into the towns. The faster Russia industrialized, the faster it would attain a perfect form of socialism and then complete communism, or so zealots like Molotov believed. It was this notion which led him to enforce policies in 1931 that deepened the crisis and led to further preventable deaths. As with most man-made famines of the 20th century, such as the Great Leap Forward in China in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Soviet government had not set out to create famine conditions in the early 1930s. But they became aware of what was happening owing to their ill-conceived policies before long, and figures like Molotov then exacerbated the famine by refusing to change course. Molotov's role in the Great Purge was also immensely unethical. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin engaged in a mass purging of the Communist Party within the Soviet Union, often removing a majority of individuals within leadership roles and governing committees in the Soviets of each region or city. In some instances, as many as 80% of the membership of certain councils was purged. Of those that were, the lucky ones were simply removed from their positions and banished from the Communist Party. Others were sent into internal exile, often to the Gulag labor camps in the cold, inhospitable East. Others still were placed on trial for alleged crimes and plotting against the state, and then executed. As the Great Purge escalated in 1937 and 1938, mass executions became more and more common. When combined with deaths in the labor camps, an estimated 1 million people are believed to have fallen victim to the Great Purge. Molotov, who may have feared suspicion after a rift developed between himself and Stalin in 1934, became complicit in the Great Purge, supporting Stalin's actions. Many decades later, he was still trying to justify his involvement, long after most Soviet officials had accepted that Stalin's purge had represented a tyrannical effort to crush any and all opposition to his dictatorship. In early May 1939, Molotov was appointed to the important position of Commissar of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, in succession to the out-of-favor Maxim Litvinov. It was a critical juncture to be promoted to the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs. Less than 2 months earlier, Nazi Germany had invaded and annexed Czechoslovakia, in violation of the Munich Agreement concluded with the British, French, and Italians in the Bavarian capital the previous September. With this, the Germans were in control of Central Europe, having already annexed Austria into a Greater Germany in March 1938. To anyone with a clear idea of Germany's ambitions, it was obvious that Poland was the next target of Hitler and the higher-ups within the Nazi setup. And once Poland was invaded or otherwise conquered, Germany would have a lengthy border with the USSR. Nazism and Bolshevism were ideological enemies, and Nazi rhetoric was filled with statements about destroying the communist specter that they suggested was haunting Europe. The question for Molotov as he assumed the position of Commissar of Foreign Affairs was how he would negotiate the situation as war loomed over Europe, with the British and French having made it clear that any violation of Polish independence would mean war. Molotov was soon negotiating intensely with his German counterpart, the Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The agreement stemmed from earlier efforts by the Germans to negotiate an economic treaty. Both sides might have considered the other to be an ideological enemy, but they had things like petroleum, iron, and automobiles that they wanted to buy from one another. In the summer of 1939, after Molotov's appointment, talks accelerated between the two foreign ministers and their staff, and there was soon progress towards not just a trade agreement, but a much more significant military and diplomatic pact. Eventually, on the 22nd of August, 1939, von Ribbentrop flew into Moscow and worked out the final elements of what was revealed the next day to the world as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the USSR. Governments were shocked to learn that the agreement involved a treaty of non-aggression between the Germans and Soviets just days before Germany would invade Poland, triggering the beginning of the Second World War in the process. Political leaders in London, Paris, and Washington would have been even more alarmed had they known of the secret clauses negotiated by Molotov and von Ribbentrop. These essentially outlined how Germany and the Soviet Union would carve up Eastern Europe between them once Germany had invaded Poland. The Soviets would claim the eastern parts of the country along with Finland and most of the Baltic states region. Thus, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact essentially was designed to allow the Soviets to reclaim the territories lost at the time of the Russian Civil War. Molotov's work was soon being realized militarily by Stalin. On the 17th of September, 1939, 2.5 weeks after the Nazis had invaded Poland from the west and with the Poles incurring heavy defeats to the Germans, the Soviets invaded the country from the east. Over the next 3 weeks, the sectors allotted to the Soviets under the agreement were occupied. Over time, the terms of the pact would be put into force in other ways. For instance, the Russians would invade the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and incorporate them into the Soviet Union. But Stalin waited until the summer of 1940, when most of the other major European states were wholly preoccupied with the German invasion of France and the Low Countries. Stalin also acquired some minor border territories around what is now Moldova, in a move which stretched the terms of the treaty Molotov had negotiated. In any event, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would not last that long. Eventually, with Western Europe conquered in May and June 1940, and with Hitler convinced that Britain would eventually join Germany against the common Bolshevik enemy, the Nazis began preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union early in 1941 and would launch Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June, 1941. Thus, Molotov's diplomatic deal lasted less than 2 years. But it was a major development in the first stages of the Second World War in Europe. One particular sphere of military activity for the Soviets that resulted from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is especially notable in terms of how Molotov's name became synonymous with homemade incendiaries. An element of the secret clauses was that the Soviets could invade and conquer Finland without the Germans objecting in any manner. After they had completed the military operation in eastern Poland in the late autumn, the Soviet Red Army was put into preparation for an invasion of Finland. The belief was that what became known as the Winter War would be a swift thing, one in which thinly populated Finland, with its small army, stood very little chance against the behemoth of the USSR. Stalin and his generals could not have been more wrong. The Finns offered determined resistance after the Red Army invaded their country at the very end of November 1939. Eventually, in mid-March, the Russians negotiated a face-saving peace agreement whereby some borderlands in Karelia were acquired by the Soviets. But in reality, the Finns had won the war by avoiding complete defeat and subjugation into the USSR. Eventually, the Finns would join in the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 and would be a key ally of the Nazis in the siege of Leningrad over nearly a 2.5-year period. It was in the midst of the Winter War that the term Molotov cocktail came into use to describe a makeshift petrol incendiary device that the Finns used extensively against the Russians. In the course of the 3.5-month war, the Soviets were at a distinct advantage in having large divisions of tanks, where the Finns barely had any mechanized cavalry. To counter this threat, the Finns began using incendiary devices where a mixture of petroleum and other flammable substances were placed in a glass flask of some kind, usually with a cloth or large wick that could be lit and then thrown, spreading flames outward when the glass shattered on impact. The environment, with Finland's many lakes and forests, was ideal for ambushing Russian tanks and launching these incendiary weapons at them. It was this which allowed the Finns to destroy hundreds of Russian armored vehicles. Reveling in the success of the weapon, the Finns developed a saying that they were sending Foreign Minister Molotov a cocktail to have with his meal. Such was the awareness that Molotov had negotiated the agreement with Germany that had led 3 months later to the Soviet invasion of Finland. Hence did this makeshift petrol bomb become known as the Molotov cocktail. Admittedly, Molotov's role in the Second World War became a bit more constructive once the Winter War had passed. In the course of 1940, the Germans turned their attentions westward and invaded and conquered Denmark and Norway in April, followed by the Low Countries and France in May and June. This left only the British standing against the Nazi menace, though Greece, too, was attempting a brave resistance against impossible odds in the Balkans, when the Nazi ally Fascist Italy was intent on creating a new Mediterranean empire. Then, a very poor strategic error was made by the Nazis in late 1940. Hitler turned his attention back eastwards and decided that the non-aggression pact that Molotov had negotiated with von Ribbentrop had served its purpose. After months of preparation in the first half of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion ever in human history, was launched on the 22nd of June, 1941, as 3 million German military personnel streamed into eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine, with the ultimate goal of taking Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad before advancing to the AA line, a strategic endpoint for the Germans in a line running from the port of Arkhangelsk on the shores of the White Sea in the north, to the Caspian port of Astrakhan in the south. A frequently overlooked detail of the invasion of the Soviet Union is that it was Molotov, as foreign minister, who made the radio declaration in the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, announcing that the Germans had invaded the USSR. He was also appointed by Stalin as deputy chairman of the hastily assembled State Defense Committee, meaning that Molotov was officially the second in command of the Soviet war effort, at least so far as the civil government went. Molotov's role now switched from maintaining a very fragile peace with Germany to overseeing a new alliance with Britain and the few countries that were at war with the Germans and their Axis allies. This initially involved a vault in Russian foreign policy, as tensions had been running high between Britain and the Soviets, in late 1939, 1940, and early 1941, had experienced serious tensions. The British had even considered sending an expeditionary force to Scandinavia to aid the Finns during the Winter War. Thus, Molotov had to patch things up in the autumn of 1941 with his British counterpart, Anthony Eden. This was easier said than done, as Molotov had become convinced that Eden was trying to orchestrate a joint Anglo-Turkish invasion of the Crimean Peninsula and southwestern Russia, after Eden had visited Istanbul early in 1941. Nevertheless, months later, Molotov undertook a risky flight over German airspace in the North Sea to land in Scotland as part of negotiations for what would become the first stages of the Allied alliance with the British. These negotiations quickly resulted in the Anglo-Soviet Agreement on the 12th of July, 1941, whereby the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union agreed to act in accord with one another against Germany, followed nearly a year later by a more detailed alliance. By then, the United States had also entered the war against the Germans and their Far Eastern ally, the Empire of Japan, after the well-known Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Molotov would be central to the subsequent negotiation of a wide range of diplomatic initiatives between the three leading Allied nations. Notably, the agreement between the US and the Soviets that Russia would declare war on Japan within 3 months of victory over Germany, in return for which, the US agreed to strategically prioritize the defeat of Germany before Japan. The US, British, and Soviets were allies during the Second World War, but they knew very well that a new clash was looming between the USSR and the Western powers once Germany, Japan, and their allies were defeated. Hence, the US and the Soviets carried out research into developing nuclear weapons during the war under a veil of secrecy. The US program, the Manhattan Project, and its ultimate results are well known. Less familiar is the Soviet program. This commenced in 1942 after the Russian physicist Georgy Flerov wrote to Stalin urging him to initiate a well-funded research program. Molotov was initially appointed to oversee the program, which was run from laboratories near Moscow. Unlike the US example, the Russian program was nearly entirely overseen by civilian administrators such as Molotov, and the lack of military personnel probably hampered its development. In any event, one of the primary impediments for the Russians was the same faced by the US and even the Nazis, the need for an adequate amount of fissile material. This was made more difficult for the Soviets by American attempts to restrict Russian access to uranium sources in the Congo and other regions. Where Molotov did make some progress was in attempting to establish spies in the US who could infiltrate the Manhattan Project. But Stalin nevertheless removed him from the project at the end of 1944 owing to its slow progress. Molotov's more important role between 1942 and 1945 was in negotiating the post-war world order at various diplomatic summits. Stalin, Churchill, and President Roosevelt often garner the majority of the attention in discussions of things like the Tehran and Yalta conferences. But Molotov, Eden, and figures like the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull made major contributions in their own right throughout. Molotov garnered a reputation as a tough negotiator at Tehran, Yalta, the post-war Potsdam Conference, and the San Francisco gathering where the United Nations was brought into being. Key points of contention tended to arise more between the British and the Russians, with the Americans often acting as arbitrators over thorny issues, such as the post-war status of Poland and Greece, two countries that Stalin was anxious to bring into the communist fold after the conflict. The Soviets succeeded when it came to Poland and accepted defeat in Greece. Through these negotiations and diplomatic meetings, Molotov struck an often paranoid figure. When visiting Britain in 1942, Molotov used to search his accommodation for bombs and slept with a revolver next to his bed, or so claimed Winston Churchill. After the war, when in Washington, D.C. to negotiate Soviet inclusion in the Lend-Lease program, whereby U.S. aid was extended to the countries directly impacted by the war in Europe, Molotov didn't just bring a revolver. He also brought his own food. The war came to an end in Europe in May 1945. It is well known that in the years that followed, the Western Allies rebuilt the economies of the countries which fell into the Western sphere of influence through the Marshall Plan, an initiative spearheaded by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall in 1948. What is usually completely overlooked is that the Marshall Plan was accompanied by the Molotov Plan, whereby financial and material aid was given to the newly communist countries of Eastern Europe to rebuild their economies after the devastation of the war. Constituent parts of the Soviet Union in Ukraine and elsewhere also benefited from it. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany all acquired aid through the Molotov Plan. The plan helped in the recovery and the beginning of a period in which many of the communist economies in Europe were about to enjoy growth levels which exceeded those found in many Western capitalist countries through the late 1940s and 1950s. However, the Molotov Plan was always contradictory. One of the tenets of the program Molotov devised in 1947 was that East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, all members of the Nazi-led Axis alliance during the war, should continue to pay war reparations to the Soviet Union. Despite being arguably the most prominent Soviet official of the 1940s, other than Stalin, at least in the civil sphere, Molotov's career took a downward turn at the end of the decade. The background to this was the 1948 visit of Golda Meir, a prominent Israeli politician who would become Prime Minister of Israel in 1969, to Moscow during the First Arab-Israeli War, to briefly act as Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union. Molotov's wife, Paulina, was Jewish and spoke Yiddish. An incident in which he translated between Meir and Molotov, as Meir spoke Yiddish, subsequently became the basis for a paranoid claim that Paulina had potentially engaged in treasonous behavior. Stalin had also long disliked. Molotov's wife, Paulina, had been arguably the last person with whom the dictator's second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, had conversed before she killed herself back in November 1932, leading Stalin to forever be suspicious of Mrs. Molotov. Now, 16 years later, she was sent into internal exile to a labor camp in the East for 5 years. Molotov was dismissed from his post as foreign minister not long afterwards in March 1949. Under Stalin's tyranny, there could be no possibility of strenuously opposing the decision. Vladislav simply had to accept what had happened and labored on as a more middling official for the next several years. It is an indication of how frail a figure Molotov could be that he would continue to defend Stalin's legacy and methods long after the dictator was dead, even though, in the final years of his life, Stalin had been in all essential ways tearing apart Molotov's career, preparing to remove him permanently from the Soviet leadership, as well as sending his wife to a labor camp. In 1952 and into early 1953, Stalin had made it clear that Molotov was finished within the leadership and was preparing to dismiss him from most of his offices, possibly violently. What saved the former foreign minister was the death of Stalin himself on the 5th of March, 1953, after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage 4 days earlier. After a complex power struggle, one in which Molotov was never seriously in contention, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as Stalin's successor. Khrushchev had been challenged by Georgy Malenkov, who became premier for 2 years down to 1955, but who was quickly undermined by Khrushchev in 1953 and only allowed to remain as premier in a largely ceremonial capacity thereafter. Nevertheless, during the power struggle, Malenkov had briefly held sufficient enough power to realign the senior ministries. And on the 5th of March, 1953, the very day Stalin died, Molotov had been reappointed as Minister of Foreign Affairs. He continued to hold the position after Khrushchev's ascent, though it was evident before long that Molotov's unrepentant Stalinist views were out of sync with the new atmosphere in the Kremlin, where Khrushchev was denouncing the former tyrant and attempting to move away from the worst excesses of the Stalinist era. Molotov was removed from the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs for the final time in June 1956, a move that came as little surprise after Khrushchev had denounced Stalin's foreign policy at the start of the Second World War and, by implication, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that Molotov had negotiated. Thereafter, he joined secretly with Malenkov and the deputy premier of the USSR, Lazar Kaganovich, to begin plotting to remove Khrushchev from power. The trio and their allies would become known as the Anti-Party Group, a collection of unreformed Stalinists who were unhappy with the drift of Soviet politics and foreign policy under Khrushchev. On the 18th of June, 1957, they attempted to overthrow Stalin's successor through diplomatic means, forcing a vote on his leadership at the 11-man party Presidium, which they won by 7 votes to 4. However, Khrushchev managed to argue successfully that a vote needed to be held within the larger Central Committee of the Communist Party. There, he managed to convince a sufficient number of individuals that the Anti-Party Group, which he referred to them as, was an unreformed group of Stalinists with blood on their hands. In the end, the attempted coup collapsed when Khrushchev won over the support of the war hero and Minister of Defense, Georgy Zhukov, who stated that the Red Army would oppose the attempted coup of Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich. The anti-party group had failed. With the foiling of the attempted coup in the summer of 1957, Molotov was not entirely purged from the Bolshevik leadership. It was a sign of how much things had changed in Russia. Had the men involved taken this course of action 5 years earlier under Stalin, every one of them would have been quickly killed. Instead, in 1957, Khrushchev decided to remove those who had attempted to overthrow him in less dramatic ways. For instance, Malenkov was sent to manage a power plant in what is now Kazakhstan. Molotov was dispatched even further east, though on the surface of it, his appointment as Soviet ambassador to the Mongolian People's Republic was a face-saving one. Nobody was fooled, though. Even the New York Times, in reporting on Molotov's dispatch to Ulaanbaatar on the 7th of September, 1957, referred to him as the fallen Soviet leader. It must be said it was a slightly more exalted fate than that Malenkov had been consigned to, or indeed Kaganovich, the latter of whom was sent to manage a potash factory in the Ural Mountains region. Conversely, this was a period of important diplomacy in Ulaanbaatar, as relations with Mongolia fluctuated owing to the wider Sino-Soviet split between the Soviets and the Chinese. Molotov was also appointed to the position of Soviet representative at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, in the late 1950s. If Molotov's appointment as ambassador to Mongolia and as Soviet representative of the IAEA were face-saving measures in the late 1950s, complete disgrace was soon to follow. Khrushchev had felt as though his position was not strong enough after the attempted coup in 1957 to completely purge the anti-party group leaders from the Soviet establishment, and had exiled them instead to Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and the Urals. By the autumn of 1961, when the 22nd Party Congress was convened, his position was much stronger. Following the success of the Cuban Revolution, the initiation of the construction of the Berlin Wall just weeks earlier, Russian successes in the burgeoning space race with the US, and also the imminent testing of the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, one which was 1,500 times stronger than the nuclear weapon dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. With his position more powerful now, Khrushchev furthered his de-Stalinization program at the 22nd Congress. This included making preparations for the complete expulsion of several of the leaders of the anti-party group from the Communist Party, Molotov included, and their removal from any offices which they held. The expulsions were carried out quietly and with little fanfare in 1962. In the months that followed, efforts were being systematically undertaken to expunge the record of Molotov's role in the Soviet regime over the last 4.5 decades, with his papers and departmental files being destroyed under Khrushchev's orders. Molotov spent many years in complete exile from the Soviet movement and leadership, though he was allowed to return to Moscow and lived out much of his later life in the Russian capital. Even the overthrow of Khrushchev in October 1964, after a number of incidents, not least his backing down at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, failed to result in Molotov being rehabilitated and brought back into the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev. He was allowed to live in quiet retirement. He appears to have spent much of the 1960s writing his memoirs, but they would never see the light of day. Nevertheless, from 1969 onwards down to his death in 1986, Molotov met on many occasions with the Soviet biographer Felix Chuev, who compiled a dossier of hundreds of pages of interview records based on these conversations. This was subsequently published in 1991 as the Soviet Union was collapsing as Stodney bez politiki, 100 Conversations with Molotov. The book was published 2 years later in English translation as Molotov Remembers, Inside Kremlin Politics. It is considered an invaluable source on the inner workings of the Soviet regime between 1917 and 1957. Its author would never return to the political fold, although when the 1983 Soviet Encyclopedic Dictionary was published, Molotov was given a 17-line entry in which his accomplishments were noted. This compared favorably with the 14 lines given for Khrushchev's entry. In the summer of 1984, Konstantin Chernenko, who served for just over a year as head of the Soviet Union in 1984 and early 1985, very quietly reinstated the 94-year-old Molotov as a member of the Communist Party. By the time he was reinstated in 1984, Molotov was a very old and ill man, and the restoration of him to the communist fold was clearly a token gesture by the regime. At the end of his life, he had suffered many heart attacks, the first seemingly as early as January 1954, when he had been too unwell to attend a high-level summit with the foreign ministers of the US, Britain, and France. It is believed that he had 7 heart attacks in all, but the number is disputed as Soviet propaganda tried to cover these up at certain times. Given this, it was something of a miracle that he survived as long as he did and lived to the ripe old age of 96, when he died in Moscow on the 8th of November, 1986. He was the second-to-last senior surviving participant of the Russian Revolution that had taken place nearly 7 decades earlier, outlasted only by Kaganovich, who died in 1991 at 97 years of age. Molotov's funeral and interment at the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow 5 days later was a small and largely private affair, attended by about 200 mourners. There was no government ceremony, and efforts were made to ensure it was very thinly covered in both the domestic and international media. Molotov could not have known it at the time, but his lifetime would largely bookend the Soviet system. He had been born back in 1890 at a time when the Russian communist movement was just beginning to take off. He died as it was being dismantled. Mikhail Gorbachev had taken over as head of the Soviet Union not long before Molotov's passing and quickly began initiating a series of policy programs designed to reform the USSR and the communist system, specifically by opening the economy up more and liberalizing the political system. This program had unintended consequences. In the course of 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe began to collapse under mass protests and civil disobedience. By 1990, the difficulties had spread to Russia itself. In the 2 years that followed, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, then the USSR, and finally the communist system itself within Russia. A decade of chaos ensued. In the course of it, much reflection was undertaken on the 3/4-century-long Soviet experiment. It was generally concluded that the Stalinist era had constituted a complete moral stain on Soviet history. Molotov, as one of Stalin's lackeys and orchestrators of much of his foreign policy, did not escape with his reputation intact. Vyacheslav Molotov was one of the most important members of the leadership of the Soviet Union between the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the end of his own career as a senior figure within the Bolshevik movement 40 years later. However, longevity is not necessarily a mark of success when discussing this time and place. Almost no other figure within the Soviet setup, other than Stalin himself, managed to survive through these decades. Nearly everyone else was sidelined or demoted as Stalin rose to power in the 1920s, engaged in the Great Purge in the 1930s, or demoted anyone that might challenge his preeminent position as Russia's wartime leader in the 1940s. The fact that Molotov managed to survive and hold senior positions throughout these decades points toward his fawning nature and complicity in Stalin's crimes. Few other Soviet officials survived at the top of the Politburo in this way or managed to make their mark on history. Yet even when it comes to Molotov's alleged accomplishments, these are hardly good things. His foremost success was in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, which freed up Nazi Germany to initiate the Second World War just over a week later and began the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe that would last for half a century. He remained an unrepentant Stalinist down to his last days, despite the fact that Stalin clearly wasn't very fond of him. His foremost legacy is that a homemade fire grenade was ironically named after him by Russia's enemies in Finland in the winter of 1939 and 1940.